Hi everyone, welcome back. Hope you had a great week. Today we'll talk about CBT for trauma survivors. We'll first begin with some general information about trauma and then talk about the impact of trauma and diagnosing trauma-related disorders. And then I'll move on to doing an overview of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT, because you will find the major clinical components that are incorporated into TFCBT are very helpful when working with clients in general using CBT approach. So let's begin. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, and social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. In defining trauma, it is important that you recognize that the subjective experience of the person who experienced traumatic events is important to consider, because the person may not perceive things as traumatic, in which case you would then define that as a trauma. But there are events that average other people would not perceive as traumatic, but if the person perceived it as traumatic, then that would be trauma for that person.
It is difficult to accurately estimate how many people are exposed to trauma, but the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is also called the ACE study, gives some perspectives understanding how prevalent trauma exposure is. So adverse childhood experiences are traumatic events that occur in childhood, such as domestic violence, child abuse, neglect, community violence. Also, there are some environmental factors that negatively influence child development, such as growing up in a household with substance abuse, mental health problems, parental separation, divorce, or parental incarceration.
Right underneath this video lecture, you will see additional videos to watch. The first video is Dr. Vincent Felidi's talk about what inspired him to conduct the ACE study, what he's found out, and what the implications are. So please pause this video lecture, watch that video, and come back to learn more about the ACE study.
This and the next slide include questions that are included in the original ACE study survey. If you're interested, you could actually do this questionnaire for yourself, add up the numbers to get your ACE score. There are a lot of agencies now that do this ACE survey as part of their routine service screening. So some of you might actually have done this in your setting.
I uploaded the entire survey to Canvas, so I encourage you, if you haven't done it before, to take time to complete the survey, because some of your clients that you'll be working with might actually complete the survey with you or through your agency. So it'll be helpful for you to find out what it feels like completing the survey.
Did you get your ACE score? If you got really high score on this questionnaire, don't get discouraged, because despite all the things that might have happened to you, You're here taking this class as a graduate student at Pitt, which means that you have a lot of protective factors that make you really resilient person. And this is how you're gonna approach your clients in your agency. If the agency administer this ACE questionnaire as part of the routine service, you want to make sure that whatever scores that your clients get don't really discourage them. Because I've heard from a lot of people when they get really high scores, that makes them feel that there's got to be something wrong with them because of all these things. And somehow they feel like they are damaged person. But make sure that whatever happened to them, while acknowledging the impact of trauma, that's really not the end of the world. The important thing is that they are there, they're managing, they're living the life that is really important to them.
There are about 25 states that are currently collecting the ACE data as part of the larger behavioral risk factor surveillance that's conducted every year in all 50 states by CDC. The survey results show that ACEs are very common. More than 60% of all adults reported having experienced at least one type of ACE, and nearly 1 in 6 adults reported having experienced 4 or more types of ACEs.
The ACE study showed that early adversity has lasting impact because those who were exposed to adverse childhood experiences had a significantly increased odds of developing all kinds of health and mental health conditions later in adulthood, which are shown on this slide.
So trauma create very serious negative long-term impact. And to better understand why that is, go to the section additional videos to watch and watch this second video that talks about the impact of trauma on brain and nervous system. So you've learned so far the serious impact of trauma, but it's also important to recognize that not all people who've been traumatized would develop clinical symptoms of trauma disorders. So those are two separate things. To diagnose trauma disorders, people look to DSM-5, trauma and stressor-related disorders category, which includes PTSD, acute stress disorder, adjustment disorder, and all the other disorders that are listed on this slide. Many of these disorders used to be included under the category of anxiety disorder in DSM-4. So this is a big change that was made in DSM-5 to create this separate category for trauma and stressor-related disorders.
To look a little more closely into diagnosing PTSD, the new DSM-5 includes 4 different criteria of symptoms that needs to be considered in diagnosing PTSD. We're not going to go into details because this topic should have been covered in your psychopathology class, but just to refresh your memories, there's got to be some intrusion experience, also called re-experiencing, through just recollection of memories or dreams. The survivors are constantly reminded of what happened. There's also avoidance criteria that the survivors has to have this behavioral pattern of trying to avoid any kind of stimulus that resemble the primary trauma experience. The other thing is that there's negative cognition that's associated with the trauma exposure. Um, because of this traumatic experience, your clients have developed a pattern of enduring thoughts, um, a kind of schema around how the person sees themselves, or seeing other people around them, or the future or the world. So this is where CBT becomes particularly relevant, because we want to identify this enduring negative pattern of thoughts and target those thoughts so that it doesn't really get in the way of the survivors really recovering from the trauma experience. The last criteria is hypervigilance or hyperarousal, which is the physiological symptoms that are associated with trauma exposure. So that fight and flight and freeze kind of response, even after the trauma stimulus is gone, the survivors still experience that physiological hypervigilance. So that's the main criteria. There are all kinds of different ways that you can diagnose PTSD. I mean, there are a variety of different measures that you can use to diagnose PTSD. Probably one of the most comprehensive one that is being used is UCLA PTSD Index. And that was what I used when I was working in the agency that I worked for, which was specialized in trauma treatment. So I added this video. It's an hour video that explains some of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD and also how to use the UCLA PTSD Index to diagnose PTSD. You do not have to watch the whole video, but just for those who may be interested in this topic, you can use it as a future reference.
There are multiple different interventions that treat trauma symptoms. The one that's used most frequently is exposure therapy, which is part of behavioral therapy, which also called flooding. And then group therapy, expressive arts therapy, such as music, dance, drama therapy, art therapy, as well as using medication. These are all valid interventions that are used to treat trauma symptoms. Among CBT-oriented interventions, TFCBT, which is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, is the one that has the most solid evidence-based. Trauma-focused CBT is an evidence-based treatment for children and parents impacted by trauma. We'll look at this intervention a little more closely because a lot of techniques that are used as part of TFCBT can also be incorporated into general CBT-oriented work.
So similarly with other regular CBT sessions, TFCBT begins with psychoeducation. So therapists engage children to teach them about trauma, what that is, and what happens after an exposure to trauma using child-friendly language. TFCBT is a manualized treatment intervention. So what you see on this slide is pages from the TFCBT manual. You could actually Google TFCBT manual and then download it. It's a PDF file. It has a lot of good information that you can use. And even if you don't do like full TFCBT intervention, there are a lot of different exercises that you could actually use from this manual. So I recommend you actually take a look at the manual, and you can also read through what's on this slide to read about how what kind of language you would use to teach children about trauma.
The manual is uploaded to Canvas in the resources section. After you do some psychoeducation to help your clients understand what's happening in them after exposure to trauma, you will engage clients in learning some relaxation skills. I mentioned that hyperarousal is one of the core clinical symptoms that are experienced by trauma survivors, and that physiological response can be very uncomfortable to manage. So it's important that you equip your clients with adequate relaxation skills early on in the treatment.
So there are multiple different approaches that you could take to teach your clients about relaxation. One that's most widely used is breathing exercise. I included a video that you could watch together with a client, or just you can learn it by watching the video and just engage your client yourself. Um, you will use different kind of techniques to teach breathing techniques depending on the age of the clients that you're working with. Um, if I work with kids, I will actually use the balloon. I mean, kids love balloons. So we'll just blow the balloons in the session together. We'll just place them on their belly so that they could actually see the balloon rises up and down as they breathe in and out. So try to think about different activities that you could do while teaching them about breathing exercise. Obviously, if you work with adults, you're gonna use different kind of YouTube video. I use music a lot because of my background in music therapy. Um, if you Google breathing exercise, there are tons of videos that you can use. You could also find music that you can use while you're reading the script. You could also Google and find a lot of different script. There's also script that's in the TF-CBT manual that you can take a look.
Progressive muscle relaxation is another technique that's frequently used to teach clients relaxation. We'll watch this video together in Zoom class, and then I will give you a chance to practice it with your partner.
The next component is affect identification and regulation. If clients are completely overwhelmed by really intense feelings and emotions, it's difficult for you to really get into meaningful cognitive work. So you want to equip your clients with the skills to identify feelings and regulate difficult emotion. So you could just use generic skills that we talked about in class, skills that you can use to teach clients about different emotions, to build their feelings vocabulary, and also teach them about the intensity of feelings, how intense feelings can get, and how they can tell whether their feelings are becoming really overwhelming. So really increasing the sensitivity toward the intensity of feelings would be important step for your clients to develop skills to regulate their difficult emotion. You can read through these manuals, the pages from the manual, to learn some of the approaches that you can take to teach your clients about affect identification regulation.
Next, you teach your clients about cognitive coping. This is where all the core CBT techniques that you learned in class become relevant. You can start with psychoeducation, teaching them about the cognitive model, how thoughts and feelings and actions are different, but they all influence each other, and how that impact their overall functioning. And it is appropriate for you to educate your clients about automatic thoughts and use some skills that you learned in class to elicit and identify automatic thoughts and modify those automatic thoughts. So at this point, you're not actually getting into looking at their beliefs, but you're mostly kind of identifying your client's thinking pattern, kind of staying in on that more superficial level of automatic thoughts. In the manual, you can see some of the scripts that you can use to educate your clients about the cognitive model and some cognitive coping skills and kids-friendly language.
The next step is the trauma narrative piece, which is really central to the TF-CBT intervention. And by this time, you have to make sure that your clients have enough understanding what trauma is and the impact of trauma, and have some awareness of what happened to them, and then the consequences, the symptoms that they're dealing with because of their trauma exposure. And also, you want to make sure that they masters relaxation skills to manage their physiological response. You also want to make sure that they can identify difficult feelings and regulate difficult feelings. And you also want to make sure that they have enough coping skills, particularly cognitive coping. When they are reminded of difficult situations or difficult time in their lives, all kinds of negative thoughts are going to come back and torment them. So you want to make sure that they have cognitive coping skills to stop negative thoughts that are associated with trauma exposure. So after your clients have reasonable level of skills to use all these techniques, you want to invite them to trauma narrative. You can take a look at the copies from the manual that are shown on this slide to get a sense of how you would introduce this trauma narrative piece to your clients. By this time, hopefully your clients have developed enough level of trust with you, and they feel okay to talk about what happened. If your client is not ready to get into this process, it's better for you to wait until they are completely ready for this process, because this process can be very intensive and very difficult for your clients and for their families. There will be lots of trauma reminders. So if they don't have enough coping skills, if they don't really trust you in really guiding you in this process, most likely this process is going to be very intimidating to your clients.
So like I said, doing trauma narrative can be very intensive and painful for your clients because they're constantly reminded of their trauma. But what's the purpose of doing that then? First of all, by writing the stories, you help your clients to make sense of what happened, and then look at it from a distance perspective so that they develop some understanding of how this trauma fit into their entire life, and find some meaning out of it. Secondly, because your client will be writing real details about like each and everything that happened to them, they are systematically exposed to painful memories and therefore can be systematically desensitized to traumatic experiences. So you're not gonna complete the entire story within one session. It'll actually take multiple sessions. It is possible that your client might get really overwhelmed when they talk about really difficult moments in that trauma, and then you're going to stop there, and then you will help your clients to use some of the relaxation skills, the affect regulation skills, and cognitive coping skills to manage those difficult responses, difficult reactions in the moment, in real time, while they are with you in the session. So once they become stabilized, you're gonna come back to writing the story. So it is going to be a step-by-step approach. And by doing that, your clients will have a chance to practice those skills that they learned previously in the session and apply to managing their trauma symptoms. Lastly, when your clients write this story, the story will contain your client's interpretation of the trauma. So it's one way for you to be able to identify any distorted and unhelpful beliefs that your clients developed because of this traumatic experience, and your clients may be still like holding on to. So when you read those stories together, you can identify those unhelpful and distorted beliefs, and you can use the skills that you learned in class to modify those thoughts to more helpful and adaptive beliefs.
There are multiple different ways for you to engage your clients in trauma narrative piece. Um, a lot of times, your clients can create a storybook that has a lot of drawing and pictures and things like that. If your client don't like to write a story, you could actually create a song that has a lyric that has some meaning to your clients that's related to the trauma experience. Or you can create a scrapebook, art book. Um, you can do a videotaping, recording, so all kinds of creative ways that you can engage your clients in narrating the trauma story. So just know that it's not just writing, but there are multiple different modalities that you can use. The next step is in vivo mastery, which primarily targets your client's avoidant behaviors, because a lot of times trauma survivors develop fear of certain situations, of people, time, and place, because those remind them of what happened. So, in this step, you want to collaborate with your client to identify their trauma reminders and develop a plan to gradually and systematically expose your clients to those feared situations. When you do this, it's important for you to find out as much as detail you can to about this feared situation, so that the plans that you develop can be specific and effective. It's helpful to get buy-in from other people who are around your clients, like family members, friends in school, so that they can actually help out your clients to this process. And you want to gradually increase the level of exposure. So you want to start with the least feared situation to the most feared situation, so that your clients can feel safe enough to begin this process and ultimately be able to conquer the most feared situation. The next step is for your clients to share their trauma narrative with significant others, um, someone who's special and important to the client. A lot of times, these are family members, parents. When the parents are actually perpetrators, um, if your clients are abused or neglected, um, sometimes I've done this with the social workers or someone in the group home, like close friends. So it could be any people that your client identify as a person whom the client can trust. And if you're working with the parents or other family members, although I didn't really talk about this, you ideally you've had developed some relationship with these people already. Because in the beginning, when you start the TFCBT process, you start with the psychoeducation. So at this point, you're gonna meet individually with your client and also individually with the caregiver so that the caregiver understand the process and along the treatment process, you want to report what happened and then make sure the caregiver really witness and understand your client's changing symptoms in the context of what's happening in therapy. So by this time, you already know the caregivers, you have relationship, they trust you, so that it's easier for you to invite them to this conjoint session. And ideally, in the very beginning, when you were meeting individually with the caregivers, and when you were educating the caregivers about the TFCBT process, you've already talked about this, how um, writing the trauma narrative is central process. And after the client's done writing the trauma narrative, they're going to share that with the caregivers. And then you want to make this session really celebratory. So this is a session where the caregivers, significant others can witness all the progress that your clients made throughout the therapy and really witness um, the moment when your clients are finally able to share the trauma story, um, the story that's really difficult for them to share. And then you really want to acknowledge this moment as a significant milestone, a significant achievement for your clients. So the final intervention components is to talk about safety and the bright future for your clients. Um, that concludes the TFCBT intervention. So far, we've talked about all the essential components of TFCBT. TFCBT, as I mentioned, is a manualized treatment approach that has a certificate program offered by the developers. In the first part of the certificate process, I think I mentioned this in class, is the web training. So I provide a link for the web training. They used to offer this as a free training, free online training, but I think like several years ago, they started charging fee, not really expensive. It's only like $35, I believe. I think probably because this is one of the required process if you want to be certified in the TFCBT modality. So this is the kind of introductory training that you could take. It's very helpful, very informative. They have a lot of skills video that you could watch. So those who are interested in doing trauma therapy in the future, I strongly recommend. And then this will give you some idea whether you would actually want to take that 2-day in-person training, which is the next step in getting certified.
So that completes today's lecture. You'll find some of the techniques that are part of the major clinical components in the TF-CBT model mentioned as additional techniques in your textbook that you can use to work with your clients when you do CBT. So psychoeducation, relaxation skills, affect identification and regulation, and in vivo mastery, trauma narrative, all of those skills, although they're not really specific to cognitive intervention, you will find them very helpful in working with your clients. So when you come back for a Zoom live session, we'll have a chance to practice those skills. So hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.